Hello writers, come write with me. My name is Mykela Greenwood. I create worlds for mind adventures. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Write with Mykela. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you can go on this journey with me. Before we get into today's video, I want to remind you that NaNoWriMo is coming up. November is National Novel Writing Month. Go sign up for free and start writing a novel in November, starting November 1st. You are aiming for 1,668 words per day. It sounds like a lot, but I'm sure you will get close. If you spend an hour and a half per day writing your stories, then you will get really close. Leave a comment below on when you sign up and if you're going to use one of our shared plots or something all your own. Now, today is Friday, which is story time, or the day of our chapter exchange. If you're writing with me and you wish to exchange chapters, then send your chapters with written permission to WritewithMykela@gmail.com. I will post the email address at the end of the video. I am looking forward to reading your chapters, even if I can't read them all on the channel. All chapters read on Fridays, whether they are mine or another writer's work, are copyright protected material, and no one may use any part in writing their own stories. This story is also PG-13, so if you are under 13 years of age, you need parental guidance. The story is in its rough draft stage, just as the last story we heard. The title of this story is Tajiia, and today we are reading chapter 12. If you would like to read along, then send an email to the email I stated above and request a PDF of the chapter. Make sure you're specific about either City of the Ancients or Tajiia and which chapter. Now let's start Tajiia chapter 12, Escape. Tokrel and Barent were ready to leave the village. It was fully dark outside, except the huntsmen and handlers had blazing fires in various places throughout the village. "We're never going to get out," stated Barent. "No, I've been reading my book," stated Tokrel. "I found a sleeping spell." "Well, you better put the dogs to sleep before the men. I can fight a man. I can't fight those dogs." "Are we assuming Rodcast will leave once the men and dogs sleep?" asked Tokrel. "Are we checking on Tajiia?" "Yes, Rodcast will leave once you cast the spell, and I will guide you out so you can concentrate. But no, we are not checking on Tajiia. Either she's out or she's not, but we can't protect her, so checking will only expose her, and we are not sure." "I'm sure," said Tokrel, "but we don't want to expose her." "Where is the Salatar? It will enhance the effects of the spell." Barent went to their bags and pulled out the herb which he had wrapped in a cloth. Tokrel used the herb in conjunction with the spell. Tokrel unknowingly added thoughts of safe passage out of the village to the spell, and unbeknownst to her, the spell of the four winds found the wish of safety and easily spread the spell across the whole village. "They're asleep," said Barent quietly as he grabbed her elbow and guided her to the door. "Don't drop the spell." He didn't know how much time they had, but they already had their bags on their backs and on their shoulders, so they wouldn't lose any time. Barent eased the door open and peered out. He could make out sleeping men and dogs near the fires, and he hoped the ones not near the fires would be also asleep. He didn't know how far the sleeping spell spread, but he hoped there was a radius around them, and those not asleep would fall asleep as they neared them, because he too did not know the spell of the four winds had aided his wife. As they got to the western edge, they heard the bleat of a goat, and that startled them. Barent thought to Rodcast, "Are you near us?" Rodcast thought in return, "I'm near the western edge of the village. I have my sister. We left a note to my parents saying that we were running away because the soldiers were scary. I didn't want to just leave them." I understand, thought Baron, but your sister... She told me over a year ago to listen to the goat, stated Broadcast. Baron sighed to himself. This was not a trip for young children. He didn't think the sister was yet 5, but he would learn that she was 7. He thought to Broadcast, we don't know how long the sleep spell will work. That was rather surreal, thought Broadcast. I kept thinking of how to get away, when all of a sudden the dogs lay down to sleep. My goat started thinking, it's time to go, it's time to go, so we left. They made it out of the village without incident. They would head west along the tree line that spread west, and once the tree line turned north, they would head northeast. And that group would head east. Sorry, I skipped a line. They would head northeast. The group that they were meeting was coming from the first village, and that group would head east and cross the river. Both groups hoped not to have to wait for the other group, and through the birds they spoke to, they had agreed not to wait too long. Thustler had gathered his wife and his 3 daughters. He had been ready to give up witchcraft and being a warlock when the soldiers took his oldest daughter to the center of the village. But then the cat chased the rat and all the commotion happened. Then they learned of the 4-wind protection on their village. Thustler and his wife discussed things in whispers after Arshwaya and Tharkek had left. The wife told Thustler that prophecy was coming true after he had told her about all the tests that Tajiia had passed. But even with those protections, they didn't want to stay under the soldiers' noses. The wife had purchased eggs and thought with the chickens and had gotten word that not everyone made it back from the meeting, and a large group was heading to the mountains in the northeast. Her and her husband then decided that they wanted to leave the village and to try to find the group. But then in the morning, the soldiers spread out in a line and walked north. They would have changed their minds, but they had gotten word from Tokrel in village 11, and Sardine in village 2, and Kassan from village 5. 4 groups in all, counting theirs, were going to meet, and they would be safer once they were together. But the question was how to leave the village undetected. Then suddenly their middle daughter said, the time to go is now. Even the dogs are sleeping. Thustler pulled the curtain aside and glanced out. He could not believe his eyes. Let's go. They quickly gathered their bags and threw them over their shoulders or on their backs, and then they crept out the door. Thustler halfway expected it to be a trap, but once outside he could even hear snoring. They quickly made their way to the edge and left the village. It wasn't long before the other 2 households of people leaving with them joined them. They wanted to talk and say, wasn't that something? They all just fell asleep. But they didn't chance it. There would be time to talk if they got away. Sardin's group and Kaisen's group had the same luck. Kaisen's group should have headed west, because the mountains in the west were much closer, but they carefully crossed the road and headed north to meet the others. The soldiers had passed the northernmost village, village 15, but they didn't continue at night. Excuse me. Close to midnight, Tajiia received this thought. How long should the huntsmen, handlers, and dogs sleep? She sat up and looked around. When Artur saw her sit up, he leaned up on his elbow and looked around. Tajiia asked him, how long do the soldiers or huntsmen sleep? Artur sat up all the way. Well, all the soldiers don't sleep at the same time. I'm sure the same is true for the huntsmen. They usually sleep in shifts, especially now with the martial law. If the king divides them into 3 groups, then they might sleep a third of the day. He paused a minute. I don't think they sleep half the day if they're divided into 2 groups. Okay, thanks, replied Tajiia. I think I was having a dream or something, but it is still good information. When she said that, Arthur thought of something else, so he raised a finger and said, "Be aware that not all soldiers who look like they are asleep are asleep." Tajiia looked at Arthur. "That is also good information." Tajiia looked around once more and then lay back down to sleep. She didn't realize that her connection to her protection spell was trying to gain information from her. The protection spells had originally cast the sleep spells with her normal sands of time number that Tajiia used, of 100,000 grains. But when the people wondered how long the huntsmen or dogs would sleep, the spell needed an answer. Kyson managed to get a horse from the barn, and she had a cart stashed in the woods. So she and another adult hitched the cart to the horse. Then they put the 3 children and 3 adults in the cart. Kyson rode the horse. She knew this was a lot for the horse, but she hoped the horse could handle it. She did know a few strength spells for the horse to help him out. As they crossed the road, Kyson decided she didn't want to cross the river, so she took a chance and rode the horse across the bridge. Then she turned the horse north and rode alongside the river. They made good time. Sodden's group went straight east to the river and then swam across. His group also had children. They made it to the eastern edge of the river as Kyson's group was riding by. They couldn't put the other group in the cart, so Kyson turned east to the closest woods. She would put the cart in the woods and unhitch the horse. Kyson hoped that once she released the horse, he made it back to her village. The 2 groups joined together and headed north. They didn't know if they would find the other 2 groups or not, but they felt better with more people. Tokarel's group had been able to travel the fastest, and they had reached the tree first. The tree was on the open plains and mostly east of Village 1. Thusler's group was larger, but they met Tokarel's group shortly after they arrived. Both groups climbed in the tree and were waiting on the other 2 groups. The goat stayed on the ground. The sun was starting to light the eastern sky, and both groups started to worry. Then Barent said, "No, I see them. Or at least I see people." "They will want to rest," replied Tokarel. "If only we could do the small spell that Tajiia did," stated Thusler. Tokarel looked at Thusler. "Tajiia?" "Yes. At the meeting we were looking for a new person, and the 3rd night it was announced that the new person was there." "Tajiia is a mute," put in Rodcast. Thusler glanced at him. "Well, she certainly didn't talk much. But I tell you that if she is not the one of the prophecies, then there are no prophecies. She was at the meeting maybe the size of an ant or a piece of dust. If we could do that, we could sleep here in the tree." "We should have gone across the village and gotten her," stated Barent. "No," put in Thusler. They both looked at him. "Tharkek and Arswea came to me. I didn't know, but suddenly I was the size of an ant and floated up to the mantle. They told me Tajiia was with them." He then recounted how he was about to give Tajiia's name for the release of his daughter and all the things that happened afterwards. By the time he finished, the other 2 groups were to the tree and climbing up, so Thusler told a summarized version to the 2 new groups. Kyson turned to Meltorba in her group. "Isn't Arswea your queen? Can you contact her? Maybe she can give the spell." Kyson motioned. "If she worked it, then she can give it." Meltorba looked at the children. "Well, we still have the children, but I will try." She wedged herself in the tree between a branch and the trunk, and then she found her bracelet to talk to Arswea. Arswea sat up and looked around. She noticed Tajiia, Arthur, Tharkek, and Chancellor Wildcard right away. They were standing in front of the air wall and looking south. Arswea hurried over to the group. "You can see them already? We won't make it to the mountain." Arthur glanced over. "No, I wouldn't say that necessarily. Tajiia has enlarged the image to see the air wall behind this one." He turned to Tajiia. "How many air walls are between us?" I'm not keeping the magnification. Is that a human word? Yes, they all answered. Oh, good. So there are 5 or 6 walls between us. Arswaya once again received the request for the spell to be as small as an ant, and could they extend that to the children? This time she was awake and more alert. She quickly pulled out her bracelet and sat down so she could communicate with whosoever it was. Tajiia noticed right away, and she remembered talking to her mother through the bracelet, so she sat down beside Arswaya. Arswaya enlarged the bowl created to a larger size and announced that Tajiia was with her and would make sure she said all the correct words. She warned, "This isn't your normal 3 to 5 word spell. Tajiia has taught us the sands of time. Now, before you protest, she also taught us numbers to put time limits on the spells." Then she suddenly asked, "Where are you that you need to be small?" "We cannot live in the villages. So last night, after the soldiers left and all the dogs and huntsmen fell asleep, we left. There are 4 groups of us," answered Meltorba. "Fell asleep?" Tajiia said quietly. Arswaya glanced up at Tajiia momentarily, and then she turned back to the bowl of water in her lap. Before she told the spell, she told Meltorba about the spell. She told how they had practiced the spell with smaller numbers. Artur sat on the ground beside Arswaya and Tajiia. He touched Arswaya's wrist. "Yes, we practiced, but we had Tajiia here to give us the next number if we needed it." Arswaya glanced up and looked at Artur. "We need the witches and warlocks together," she said. "But how much can they remember?" Torquil leaned over Meltorba's bowl and said, "I have paper." "Good," said Arswaya. "I will give you the order in human, and then the translations, and then the numbers. We can't stay long because the soldiers are only 5 or 6 air walls behind us, but we can hopefully stop at noon and see how you are doing." Meltorba's group seemed to think that was okay, so Arswaya gave the words and Torquil wrote them down. When Arswaya finished, Artur had them up and walking again. As they walked, many in the group passed around the word that some witches and warlocks had escaped the villages and were on their way. That seemed to raise the hope of many, but Arswaya wasn't sure that was the best. The last night at the meeting, she had wanted everyone to make it home safely, and that hadn't happened. Now they were on the run, and the soldiers were behind them. Then Arswaya looked around for Tajiia, and she saw that she was behind the group and talking to a bird. Akel touched her arm and whispered, "I was able to hear some of the conversation. Tajiia will soon know how to fly." Sure enough, after a few minutes more, there were 2 birds on the ground, and one bird seemed to be showing the other bird how to hold its wings. Several in the group turned back and saw the 2 birds. Balak ran over closer, but not too close to scare the real bird. He said the words to become a bird, and he looked like a nondescript bird instead of like the bird Tajiia was talking to. Several others joined Balak. Artur announced, "Okay, if you're able to fly, then fly towards the mountain." "This is no longer an exercise for the mentees," stated Varant, and he said the words to become a bird. The real bird flew up, and Tajiia flapped and flapped her wings. The real bird landed in front of her and fussed at her. Tajiia tried again. This time she rose up a few inches off the ground. Akel clasped her hands together. "Oh, I hope this works." Arswaya looked at Akel and asked, "Are you not going to try too?" Started Akel. "I guess so." So the 2 women went over and joined the ever-growing circle of various birds. Most of the different birds were just nondescript, but it depended on what the person pictured in their mind. Several birds started flapping their wings like Tajiia had done, and some lifted up off the ground, but some stayed on the ground. Merk started jumping up and flapping his wings until the bird came over and fussed at him. Artur said, You don't want to use all your strength jumping. You want to use your strength flapping and flying. Ator flapped his wings and raised up several inches. Then he flew forward. I got it! Look, I'm flying! He kept flying 6 to 8 inches above the ground. Then everyone heard a noise emit from the bird, and it sounded like laughing. Several in the group decided that it was indeed funny to see a bird flying so close to the ground. There were varying degrees of success among the group, and after they finished the exercise, a small group wanted to fly to the people that had just left their villages and help them to join the group. Arswaya said, I'm not sure that being among our group is the best. Maybe if you get them, then bring them all the way to the mountains, or whichever mountains they're heading towards. Hold on, said Ator. I have some issues with this plan. While we want everyone together, we will be safer with a larger number of people. At one point he had worried about the king talking to animals, but Tajiia had disputed that, and now they could change to look or become different animals inside and out. So that wasn't the most urgent worry anymore. Chancellor Wykela said, when I first joined this group, you, Ator, said that Arswaya assigned you to the wrong group. So your words are from the past. We don't need to worry about Tajiia's safety. He paused a few minutes. Now, how much have I learned being in this group? I say I have several tests to take now. And if we are to fight these soldiers that outnumber us more than 2 to 3 times, then we all need to learn. He glanced at Arswaya. I understand wanting everyone safe, but I just flew. I may not be able to fly up to the heights of a tall tree, but it is better, stated Arswaya. I understand. She looked at the volunteers. Bring them to us, and we will teach everyone, and we will arrive at the mountain together. Darkek volunteered to go with them because he knew how to tie people onto birds. And then they decided to head to the groups once they talked to some more real birds and got a ride. After Thustler's group practiced the spell to last 5 minutes, they decided to try to sleep in the tree for now. And once they had rested, they would try the spell again as they were walking north. They didn't know that they would go slower when they were smaller, but they weren't in a hurry to catch up with the soldiers. They planned to sleep a couple of hours. The goat wasn't small, nor was she in the tree, and most felt she would warn them of soldiers, or at least that was their hope. The huntsman woke and looked around to see who saw them sleeping. The dogs woke and stretched. Their comrades came out to relieve them, and it didn't seem like anyone knew that people were missing yet. Once they realized people were missing, they would have to decide what to do. The second group of soldiers behind Tajiia's group awoke and got into their formation of one long line, which was no longer 8 deep. And once commanders gave the command to march, they again walked north. It wasn't long before their line walked through the next air wall, and this wall was the first set with the spell. Okay, that has to change because I have the soldiers mixed up. There's an edit for you and a mistake. Okay, let's continue. The whole line stopped, even those who didn't walk through an air wall, but walked through the space between walls. At first, the soldiers looked at all the clothes on the ground, and then they looked at each other. As they saw the face of Waggler instead of a comrade, they went to pull their sword. But then they noticed their sword was gone, and so was their armor. Each soldier without armor looked down at himself. The ones with armor didn't know if they should attack the Waggler to their left or to their right. Commander started shouting, "There's a warlock among us. It is a trick. Keep marching." Several soldiers grabbed the clothes on the ground and jumped in them to cover up their underclothes, and then they once again started marching, but they cast wary glances to either side of themselves. Tajia's group found a small flock of 12 birds, and the 15 volunteers were dividing themselves up to ride the birds. Our plan did not work, Tajiia stated. If we had left the armor on, the soldiers may have attacked each other, but they just put on their clothes and continued marching north. Maybe you shouldn't have them all the same, stated Artur. I don't know how you would do different things. Arsuea motioned the birds away, and the birds took to flight. After a little way away, the birds split into groups of 3. Tharkek and the other riders didn't realize it at first, and they weren't sure what happened or why after they realized it. Tajiia sat down and tried to think of how to change things. Then she realized she still had connections not only to the airwalls, but also to the soldiers with the spell. So she started releasing the spell on every 5th soldier. She decided to release more in a little more time, but she would decide when, based on the reactions she felt. Artur, of course, suggested that those that could fly should fly to the mountain, except, of course, Tajiia. He asked her to stay back with those that could not fly. Arsuea didn't like the idea. She wanted them to stay together. Shaful showed her drawing. There are a couple animals on here that are faster, like this one. A horse can run. What's the word for horse in which? Cobio, stated Tajiia. But haven't we learned any lessons yet? We can change into these things, but we don't automatically have the ability. But I know how to run, stated Balak. On 2 legs, put in Tajiia. When some of the soldiers changed back and others didn't, it spooked the soldiers even more. Several captains who had spread themselves out among the troops kept their heads and asked questions of those who looked like they were supposed to look. The questions were personal, and others had to verify. Then a few who looked like they should pointed to the ones who wore Waggler's head and asked about them, until finally everyone verified each other. Since Tajiia had left herself connected to several soldiers, she realized what happened, and that helped her develop her next plan. So when the soldiers walked through her next air wall, they each looked like a commander, and she was very glad they stopped again. She didn't know what to do about all the soldiers that recently left her village. These soldiers that follow them now followed them almost from the beginning, or at least since they rescued all the groups in the woods. And although these soldiers were closer to them, they were thankfully somewhat fewer in number. Tajiia feared the number she felt that had left the village a day or 2 ago, because they were walking through her first wall. But she didn't want to alarm the people with her, so she just thought of what she could do and what spells she could use on her air walls. Tajiia looked around the group, and she could feel the nervousness building. She thought that was strange, because the mountains had finally come into view. Arsuea and Artur both leaned in towards Akel and said quietly, "She needs you to explain the nervousness." They both stopped and looked at each other. Artur motioned, "We're in sight of the mountains." Akel glanced between them and then caught up to her daughter. She took Tajia's hand and walked with her. Instead of explaining per se, Akel told Tajiia of a time when she was within sight of the mountain. She had soldiers behind her, causing her to run until she could not breathe. And then suddenly, there were soldiers ahead of her. She finished by saying there were protections within the mountain, but one had to make it into the chambers within the mountain. But one had to make it into the chambers that were higher up, and that day she did not make it. The soldiers had arrested her. Tajiia looked around. "Maybe many of these people have had your experience, Mom, because many want to break out into a run now." Akel rubbed Tajia's hand. "Yes, dear. Either they've had the experience or they've heard stories of others' experiences." "Do you think there will be soldiers before us today?" asked Tajiia. At that question, Akel became very nervous as she looked around. "Oh, I hope not." Tajiia looked around again. She saw a large group gathered around Shafel and looking at her drawings. Tajiia then saw Balak turn into a horse. The horse's head went up and down, and the horse ran in a circle, or swung its head side to side. "I can't see like this," stated Balak. Tajiia softly spoke some words, and her mother, who walked beside her, strained to catch as many of the words as she could. After a few minutes, Mykela looked around, but she didn't see anything differently. "What spell did you say?" she asked. Some of it sounded like the invisibility spell. "We are invisible under the bubble," confirmed Tajiia, "but we are visible inside." Mykela looked around. "But we don't know we're invisible," she said. "That's why I don't use this spell so often," replied Tajiia. Mykela sighed to herself. She turned back to Urswea and announced, "We are invisible outside the bubble, but visible inside to ourselves." The group stopped walking and they exchanged glances. A few people slightly raised their hands and were going to ask how to know where the boundaries of the visibility bubble were, but the question died upon their lips. "Tajiia," stated Artur, "can we exit the bubble?" Tajiia turned back. "We will be able to exit onto the mountain path." She turned back and continued walking. Balak returned to being himself, and everyone continued walking. Most unconsciously quickened their pace, and the rest sped up to keep up. Of course, they couldn't keep the faster pace for long, and they would still have to sleep on the plains at least one more night. Many felt better with the mountains in sight, but they still wanted to be in the safety of the mountain halls. Finally, Tarkek's group landed in the tree with the 4 groups, and shortly behind his group, another group landed, and then another and another. The witches and warlocks looked around startled at all the birds. Now, Tarkek truly didn't know why the birds had separated, but he didn't worry about it. He started untying his group and putting them in the tree. He noticed that several people were on the ground with the goat, but some of the people in the tree seemed already to be small. Tarkek reversed the small spell, and many in the tree jumped. "How did you get here?" asked Barent. Thessler grew back to his normal size, as did his 3 daughters and his wife. "How is not the question, but why?" "Urswea wants us together," stated Tarkek, as several more people became their normal size. Tarkek dramatically looked down to the people on the ground. "Oh," started Thessler. "They fell out of the tree and they aren't brave enough to climb back up. They said they could be small on the ground." Tarkek nodded once, and then he started the instructions. Before he finished the instructions, they heard dogs barking in the distance. The people on the ground quickly climbed up, and the goat started bleeding. Several in the tree once again said their spell, but after a minute they grew large again. Tarkek shrank the goat and raised it up, and he said to the people, "Use Dadi Wadit Sasi Python for the grains. I think that is an hour instead of a minute." "It might take them an hour to get here," stated Barent. "I understand," replied Tarkek, "but it will take time to get everyone tied onto the birds to leave the tree." I didn't think the huntsmen and handlers would leave the villages," stated Thessler. "Once we left the village, I'm sure the king felt we lost the protection," stated Tokrel. "Is Tajiia in the mountain?" asked Thessler. Barent looked at Thessler and immediately knew Thessler would do anything to protect himself and his family. "No," replied Tarkek. "Our group has not made it to the mountains." "Are you bringing us to Tajiia or to the mountains?" pressed Thessler. "Which do you prefer?" asked Tarkek. "I myself want to go back to Tajiia. She is teaching our group a lot of magic. And look, we sit here in the tree, small as ants, as the handlers and their dogs approach us." "The dogs may still smell us," put in Kyson. "Yes," replied Tarkek, "but when the birds lift off out of the tree, the soldiers will think the dogs smelled the birds. I want to learn magic. Tajiia knows more than anything I've ever heard in the legends and the myths. We have 4 groups of birds here, and we can bring some of you to Tajiia and some to the mountain. So while the huntsmen and handlers approach, you need to decide. We will tie you onto the birds, and we will fly away." Dustler raised his hand. "I and my family want the mountains." "Tajiia is the future queen," stated Toquel. "She needs our protection. The soldiers are behind her." "I appreciate your sentiments," stated Tharkek, "but Tajiia doesn't need our protection. We need her lessons." So the witches, warlocks, and 2 wizards decided where they wanted to go. Dustler and his family and 11 others, including Rodkat's sister, were all going all the way to the mountain, and they fit on one set of 3 birds. The birds flew away before the huntsmen and handlers got too close. The leader of each group tied on the rest of the 4 groups to the other 9 birds, including the goat, which they told Rodcast to hold on to as well. The birds lifted into flight 3 at a time as the handlers were approaching. The dogs' barking was incredibly loud, and it was maddening. Several thought they had lost their mind to meet at the tree, but they were glad they were safely flying away. When they landed and slid to the ground, but were not with Tajiia or in the mountains, this startled all of them, because Tharkek had forgotten to explain that the birds needed to rest. After a short explanation, they all settled down, and then after a short rest, they flew on to their destinations. Dusk had passed, and the shadows of everyone in Tajia's group were long. Arswea, Artur, and several others discussed the groups of birds returning to them. Artur had stated that while he agreed with Arswea that the birds probably could get through the air wall, he had watched for birds over the past hour, and he hadn't seen any. Tajiia was not part of that conversation, but she didn't know what to do. She could feel the birds getting closer, and she couldn't feel any soldiers, so she wanted to release the invisibility. She pulled on her mother's hand and wrapped her other arm around her mother's arm. "What is it, dear?" asked Akil. "I told everyone they could exit the air wall at the mountain pass, but the birds are nearing us." Akil looked around. "I think it has passed dusk, and we will be hard to see in this light. If we don't start any campfires, we should be fine." Arswea had paid attention to the pair and their conversation, so she announced the plans to the group. Then Tajiia reversed the spell on the air wall and sat down. Most just sat down as well, and no circle of people gathered around Tajiia. A few in the group decided to become a tree, which startled people nearby, but after the first several, no one reacted anymore. Tharkek didn't remember there being trees on the plains before the mountains, at least not the mountains in the north. So at first, when the birds landed in the tree, he just thought they were resting, and then he noticed the group. Tharkek and the other 2 leaders and 3 extra volunteers started untying people and floating them down among Tajia's group. Then they released the small spell, and everyone jumped. And then the people that changed into trees changed back, and the rescue people jumped. Some laughed nervously, and some whispered to a person near them that it was good that King Pomodestone didn't have anyone that could do that. It would be scary to suddenly have his troops sitting among them. When Artur heard the people talking, he asked Tajiia, "Tajiia, have any of your plans worked?" Tajiia shook her head. Well, started Arswea as she looked at Tajiia. "Are there any you want to share?" "You didn't think your squirrel idea worked, but it has been wonderful." She motioned. "Did you see the trees?" The new people didn't understand Arswea, but they just looked around at the faces. When they left last night, they had thought it would be several days before they even saw the mountains. Yet here the mountains were in sight, and they had ridden a small bird to get here. Tajiia thought through some things. "Well, they already didn't trust each other, so I think I just gave them different things not to trust. But I'm not really sure that helps." That's how the first groups just started killing each other. Barrett, started Tokril. She does talk. It was a ruse. We think she speaks witch much better than human, put in Saful. Tajiia glanced around and then looked down. Her mother, Akel, lifted her chin and said, "These are your people, and they mean no harm." "Nope, no harm meant," reiterated Saful. "Most of us wish we knew as much witch as you." "I'd be good with knowing half as much as her," put in Bollock. Tajiia looked at him, and he smiled at her. Tajiia returned his smile. Atur, Tharkek, Raisler, Arswea, and several others gathered around Tajiia, and she told the things she tried, while the rest of the group talked to the new people about numbers and other words in witch. Saful hoped to get Tajiia to help her label her drawings in witch, but she would wait. After some time, everyone laid down and went to sleep, except Artur. He stayed awake a long time, processing everything Tajiia had tried. He also processed Tajiia's perception of failure. He didn't think she had failed. Maybe she got unexpected results. But who could predict how these soldiers would react to such magic? He felt if they killed each other, then the witches, warlocks, and few wizards wouldn't have so many to fight. Then he thought, maybe that was why Tajiia didn't feel like she accomplished anything, because the soldiers hadn't killed each other like they had when she helped rescue parts of their group from the dogs. They only trusted each other less and became wary. He realized that the soldiers were unpredictable when they were so wary, and perhaps that frightened Tajiia. Atur then reflected on some of the stories he heard from those rescued from the dogs, and he had to admit that the unpredictability was indeed very scary. Then Atur latched on to what Tajiia had said about the first groups. Once all the people for the 7 original groups left the woods, did soldiers start following them? That was possible. So was that 5 to 6 air walls back? And if so, how much farther back were the soldiers from the villages? Then Atur realized that he had checked to make sure that Tajiia had undone the air wall each morning. So had Tajiia gone back and put walls? That was possible. It was also possible that Tajiia put the walls after she placed the protection and curse on each village. Atur knew that many long days lay ahead, so he lay down and went to sleep. The real commanders among the soldiers ordered several soldiers to light torches so they could continue into the darkness. This first group of soldiers didn't know about the line of soldiers marching north behind them, and they didn't know about the huntsmen and handlers behind them. What they thought they knew was there was a small group of witches and warlocks that they had trapped in the special area, and that group split into several groups, and all the groups were fleeing north. They didn't know the groups had joined back together, but they assumed they would try to join together, which would make their job easier. Their assignment was to kill off all in this small group, and then invade the mountain and make sure no one was there. King Pumoldstone knew the witches and warlocks preferred the hideaway in the northern mountains, and he decided to concentrate all his forces on that one first, and then he would decide on which one he would annihilate next. He was furious that someone placed protections on the villages, because to him that meant someone was practicing magic without permission, and that person needed to die, and their head hung on a post in their village. As the soldiers continued walking, several once again walked through an air wall. Several with torches jerked to this side and that side, and they saw dogs, and the dogs weren't on leashes, nor were they under the control of a handler. Several with torches waved the torches towards the dogs, and the other soldiers drew their swords. Royal commanders started shouting not to harm the dogs, that they needed the dogs. They needed the dogs to help them search the mountains. The soldiers shouted back that the dogs would eat them. They had seen that happen in the woods. But while the dogs did bark, Tajiia would not cause them to eat the people. Her magic only caused the change. The dogs were barking because they were trying to talk, to tell someone to help them, or to tell someone who they were. But Tajiia had heard Artur talk as a squirrel. Therefore, she had adjusted the spell by adding words to it so the soldiers would sound like the form they were in. It seemed a standoff. Soldiers held out their swords, ready to strike. Other soldiers swung the torches, and the dogs just barked and barked. Finally, a commander called out, "Okay, we will rest here tonight. We want to see what these witches and warlocks are doing to us, so we will wait until sunrise to keep moving." Okay, writers, that is the end of chapter 12. Leave a comment below on if you would have left the village or not. Leave that comment. If you did leave, would you think that some of the huntsmen and handlers would follow you? Or you think that maybe they would just leave you to the soldiers that you were following? Leave it to them. They'll handle it. We're told to stay here. So would you think they would follow you? Would you have them follow you if you were writing this story? That kind of thing. Also, did you notice the personification? A bird was teaching Tajiia, and it fussed at her, and then it laughed at Merk. No, it fussed at Merk too. It laughed at Artur. There is a lot of personification of animals in this story because the witching community can talk to the animals. So that helps me to just build that in. And I think it was kind of funny when the bird was laughing at Artur and he's just flying along 6 to 8 inches above the ground. So you can kind of see, and that kind of lightens things up a little bit. So you're running, you're afraid of the soldiers, more soldiers are coming. You've got friends that are escaping, and then you have this little bird laughing at you. So it kind of lightens up the load and stuff. And so it's not all just dreary, dark stuff, or, action or fight or flight or whatever. So there's a little bit of humor there. And you can do that with the personification or any other thing you can add humor. But I wanted to point out the personification here. Join me Tuesday. We will discuss some words that are out of date for for today's time, but they might match your setting. Join me Friday. We will read chapter 13, more escapees, more animals. Visit my website, WritewithMykela.com, and read some character bios. Leave a comment on which characters are your favorites so far. I hope you're enjoying writing your stories as much as I am. Don't forget to share your stories by sending them to WritewithMykela@gmail.com. That's the chapter exchange part. When you share your chapters with me and I share my chapter with you, no polishing required. You heard the mistake above. I had the 2 sets of soldiers kind of confused. And I think that's because I never put that scene in when the soldiers left the woods. And so when I go back and I fix that, then everything else will kind of just fall into place and get fixed. So no polishing required because I haven't polished mine. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and the bell so we can continue to write together and these videos get pushed out to more people so more people can enjoy them and they can write with us. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your participation. If you know someone who would like this video, then please share it with them. This is Mykela with Write with Mykela. Bye for now.